Thanks very much, Shirley, and everyone for coming tonight. So I'm Michaela Dommisse. I'm a researcher, and I'm here because I care deeply about how we protect ecosystems that we depend on while we decarbonise our biggest supply chain, shipping. If you want to know a little bit more about SOCIA, we've got a couple of the directors here. Jill Goby in the front, just raise a hand, and Matt Neal somewhere hiding in the back here. So please, hit them up for a beer. So let's have a look at Australia maritime snapshot. Shipping is absolutely fundamental to Australian economy. Over 99% of our trade by volume moves by sea. That's nearly $755 billion in value each year. But the challenge is we rely heavily on shipping, but we don't actually own the vessels or supply the fuel. In the past year, more than 30,000 foreign flag vessels entered Australian ports, and they came from a pool of 6,000 unique vessels. By contrast, at last count in 2021, there were less than 11 significant Australian flagged ships operating. I think it's even less than that now, close to zero. So we're deeply dependent on a global fleet, one largely powered by fossil fuels to move our exports. And those exports, they are some of the most carbon-intensive commodities in the world: iron ore, coal, and LNG. As a result, our trade contributes to around 4% of global shipping emissions, and that's a really disproportionately large footprint for a single small island economy. Technically, those aren't our emissions under international accounting rules. They belong to the flag states, but they're driven by our economic activity and are our embodied emissions. So the implication is clear. If we're serious about decarbonising our economy, we can't afford to ignore these emissions generated along our supply chains. We have to green the supply chain, or we won't be able to deliver a credible, complete path to net zero. Broadening out a little bit, globally, I'll hang on for a second because I've got a very soft voice. The shipping sector emits close to 1 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. If it was a country, it would be between the 6th or the 8th largest emitter. In response, the IMO has now set clear targets as of 2023. So a 20 to 30% reduction by 2030 and a goal of reaching net zero by 2050, with the hope of having between 5 to 10% of fuels to be low or zero carbon fuel by 2030. But this chart really illustrates where we are in relation to those targets. Essentially, it's highly insufficient. At the moment, one pathway where we need to get us down to 1.5 degrees above industrial levels, warming. This is where we are right now, the amber, if we just were to continue business as usual with the same number of ships that we have, and it puts us between 2 and 3 degrees. And the pathway we're on at the moment is absolutely catastrophic, sits above 4 degrees. So unfortunately, time is really critical. Ships built today will be in service in 2050, and the fuels we need are still scaling up. The infrastructure to support them takes years to plan and build. Every year we delay makes the task harder, more expensive, and more disruptive. That's why we have to act now, improving operational efficiency while preparing for future fuels of tomorrow. We've also got a bit of external pressure from the outside too. The IMO is guiding the direction, but big decisions are due in April. Things like the carbon pricing and global fuel rules are coming. Hopefully they will be agreed and enacted. And meanwhile, the EU is actually not waiting because they consider the IMO too slow. Their emissions trading scheme is now actually in operation as of 2024. From this year, ships pay for 50% of the emissions on EU routes. If it's entirely within the EU, that's 100% of emissions payment. In 2026, the CBAM kicks in. This is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, essentially to stop carbon leakage. It slaps a carbon price on high carbon imports, including emissions from how they are shipped. Others are now starting to join in, just most recently the UK as a few hours ago. The same sorts of legislation. So it's quite interesting to kind of put it in an Australian perspective about what that would mean if we plug in our numbers. So roughly about 6,200 ships visit our shores. To hit that IMO 5% clean target, we would need at least more than 300 of those to be running on low or zero fuel by 2030. That's less than 5 years from now. At the moment, we have no ships running operationally, although Matt is going to give us a snapshot of our future. And to meet that 30% cut, we have to reduce between 8 and 12 million tonnes of carbon dioxide every year on year to 2030. It's absolutely staggering where we are and where we need to get to. If we don't prepare, we face high trade costs, lose access to those cleaner vessels, and we potentially get left behind. So what are we actually doing? Fortunately, we're not starting from scratch. There are some really solid foundations already in place. There is legislation, the safeguard mechanism. It's our main emissions policy in Australia. It doesn't cover Scope 3 emissions yet, but at least it's a framework that has potential to in the future, if we move in this direction quickly. And then there's MRNAP, the Maritime Emissions Reduction National Action Plan. Now that work came out a few years ago with a lot of industry consultation. The idea is that that's your actual roadmap to 2030 and 2050. Unfortunately, it's delayed. Most likely, there will only be a release after the election and if the same government remains in place. That's the feedback from the government that we've had. And it's really not shaping up to be a full implementation plan, or rather more like a framework or a guidance document that will be housed in other policies. So we need more partnerships and action to actually drive real progress. We're also seeing some exciting pilots. Talk about green corridors, some early feasibility studies, a digital maritime corridor with Singapore potentially underway, and then industry trials of alternative fuels. Most recently, we saw ammonia bunkering in Port Hedland. On the vessel side, there's really great momentum, and I think we can be proud of Australian shipbuilders. Stepping up, so INCAP Tasmania is developing an electric ferry. Austal, all working together. In this case, hydrogen power vessels, and of course we're going to hear a little bit more about the Green Pioneer. The ports are moving too, and Craig, as the next speaker, is going to update on that. So yes, there's a lot going on, but it's really patchy and it's fragmented, and it's not enough. You saw those targets, you saw the reality of where we are now, so we have to step on the fuel really quickly. We need all this. We need national scale planning, aligned investments, and a clearer policy direction if we want to get to where we need to be. So we need to move essentially from our pledges to a plan. We've been speaking to a lot of stakeholders in the maritime industry, and the feedback is really, really clear. Everyone has a very, very high willingness to act. Industry really wants to move forward. But right now, things are too fragmented, siloed, and not at scale. We need this national coordination and access to much greater funding to help bridge the gaps. So to do that, essentially, we really need to see Australia, take ownership of its emissions and align with the international rules. We need to start really mapping out the emissions landscape within the supply chains. And that means, looking at port capabilities, looking at what infrastructure exists, what needs there are, and really creating a plan based on Australian needs looking forward. And then we have to run real-world pilots that fill the gaps that we recognise, rather than just being passive in relation to what's arriving on our doorstep. And while we work towards that, there are also some really quick wins, things that we can do right now to cut emissions. One of the best examples, I think, is port efficiency, and this has real relevance for Australia because we don't own ships and we don't bunker. Essentially, all our leverage comes out of our domestic operations. A really great example of fantastic port efficiency is Singapore's maritime single window. Now, what they've done here is the port is integrating both upstream and downstream, so the entire supply chain efficiency into its operations. On a single digital platform, there's no silos. Their just-in-time arrivals are coordinated across customers, port authorities, and shipping lines using almost real-time data from sensors, drones, and satellites to populate a digital twin of the port, so they can make decisions, really powerful decisions, quite quickly. And the results have been quite astounding just in this early phase. Ship spends less time anchored offshore, their port stays are much shorter, the fuel burn has dropped significantly at about 15% per vessel, and that's halfway there to the 2030 target that we need to reach. So it's smart, it's scalable, and it works. Australia is also thinking of building a version of a maritime single window, but it's still in development and needs to accelerate. It also needs to be fit for purpose. not just copying Singapore, but scaled to our local areas and our specific port types. So this kind of digital infrastructure really gives us a chance to cut emissions now. We can't afford to wait. In summary, to wrap it up, Australia is a maritime nation. Shipping is our biggest supply chain. We don't own ships, but we influence the system through policy, port infrastructure, and regulation. Without a clear plan, we will fail on climate and trade. We need a national decarbonisation roadmap that is practical, flexible, and aligned with global moves, backed by government, industry, and research. And we need to fast-track simple wins like port optimisation right now. We made the pledge. It's time to plan, invest, and to act. Thank you.